I was 23 years old when I found myself lying in a frozen shell crater outside Bastogne in December 1944, watching German armor roll toward our lines through my binoculars with hands so cold I could barely feel the metal against my face. My name was Second Lieutenant James Kellerman, and I was a forward observer for the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion attached to the 101st Airborne Division, which meant my job was to be the eyes for our guns 3 miles behind me and to put artillery shells exactly where they needed to go. I'd been doing this job for 6 months across France and into Belgium, and I was good at it. But nothing in my training at Fort Sill had prepared me for what it felt like to watch an entire Panzer column materializing out of the snow and fog, knowing that we had maybe 30 rounds of 105mm ammunition left for the whole battery. The thing about being a forward observer that nobody tells you in training is that you spend most of your time way out in front of everyone else, usually in the worst possible position you can find, because that's where you can actually see the enemy. You're not with the infantry guys who at least have each other and some semblance of a line, and you're definitely not back with the artillery crews who get to work their guns from relative safety. You're out there with maybe 1 or 2 other guys, a radio operator and sometimes a driver, if you're lucky enough to have a jeep that still runs, and your entire purpose is to get close enough to the enemy to direct fire onto them without getting so close that they kill you before you can call it in. It's a lonely job, and in Bastogne it was a cold one, in ways that had nothing to do with the December weather. I got to Bastogne on December 19th, the same day the Germans completed their encirclement of the town, which meant I'd been there exactly 4 days when I found myself in that crater watching those Panzers. We'd been rushed up from reserve positions near Rams, when news came through that the Germans had broken through in the Ardennes, and nobody really understood the scope of what was happening until we started seeing the roads clogged with American units retreating in complete chaos. We rolled into Bastogne in the backs of cattle trucks, because that's all the transport they could find on short notice, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet the artillery was. Not silent, you understand, because there were guns firing all around the perimeter, but quiet in a way that told you every single round was being counted and rationed like gold. My battalion commander was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Elkins, a West Point guy who'd been in North Africa and Sicily before they stuck him with a bunch of paratroopers who mostly didn't jump out of planes anymore. He called me into the command post that first night, which was the basement of a half-destroyed building that smelled like cordite and wet concrete, and he laid it out for me straight. "Kellerman," he said, looking at me with eyes that hadn't seen sleep in probably 3 days, "we've got 8 105mm howitzers operational and approximately 400 rounds of ammunition for all of them combined. That works out to 50 rounds per gun, and we're completely surrounded with no resupply coming until this weather clears enough for airdrops." He paused to let that sink in, then continued. "Division wants aggressive defensive fires to break up any German concentrations before they can mass for an assault, which means you and the other FOs are going to have to make every single mission count. No ranging rounds, no adjusting fire unless absolutely necessary, and no missions at all unless you've got a target worth the ammunition. Are we clear?" I told him we were clear, and I meant it. But understanding something intellectually and living with it in practice are 2 very different things. The next morning, I moved forward with my radio operator, a kid from Ohio named Private Eddie Kowalski, who was 19 and had never been in combat before getting attached to my team 2 weeks earlier, and we set up an observation post in what used to be a barn about 800 yards in front of our artillery positions. The barn didn't have a roof anymore, and only 2 walls were still standing, but it gave us a decent view of the approaches from the northeast, where intelligence said the Germans were probably going to push. We spent that whole first day just watching and freezing, calling back grid coordinates for possible targets, but never actually firing because nothing developed into a concentration worth the shells. The temperature that week dropped to around 10 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and well below 0 at night, and the snow kept coming down in waves that limited visibility to maybe 300 yards on a good day. We didn't have proper winter gear because nobody had expected us to be fighting in December in Belgium, so we wore every piece of clothing we could scrounge and still felt the cold working its way into your bones until you couldn't remember what being warm felt like. Kowalski developed a cough on the second day that sounded wet and deep, and I knew he probably had the beginning of pneumonia, but there was nowhere to send him and no replacement, even if there was. We just kept watching the fog and snow, waiting for something to happen. The German probing attack started on December 21st, small groups of infantry trying to find weak spots in our perimeter, and I called fire on 2 of them that day. The first mission I gave them a grid coordinate and requested 1 round high explosive, and I held my breath waiting to see where it would land, because a ranging shot was technically against orders, but I needed to know where our fire was falling. The round came in about 75 yards long and 50 yards left of where I wanted it, which told me our survey data was off, or the crews were having trouble with their firing solutions in the cold, and I made the mental adjustment for future missions. For the second mission, I corrected based on what I'd learned, called for 3 rounds, and put them right into a German squad that was trying to work its way along a tree line toward our positions. I watched through my binoculars as the shells impacted, saw bodies thrown into the air, saw the survivors scatter back into the woods. It was efficient, and it was necessary, and it made me feel sick in a way I'd gotten used to, but never comfortable with. By December 22nd, we were down to maybe 30 rounds per gun, and the weather was getting worse, which meant no airdrops and no resupply of anything. Not just ammunition, but also food and medical supplies and winter clothing. The German attacks were intensifying, coming from multiple directions now, and every FO team was being pushed to call fires that would stop entire companies with single fire missions. I'd moved my observation post 3 times by then, always trying to stay ahead of the German advance, always trying to find that perfect position where I could see everything they were doing without being seen myself. The position I ended up in on the 23rd was that shell crater I mentioned, which wasn't much of a position at all, but it was the only cover available that gave me line of sight to a road junction about 1,200 yards to my northeast, where intelligence said armor might try to push through. Kowalski and I spent the night of December 22nd in that crater, which was maybe 6 feet across and 3 feet deep, and filled with a mixture of frozen mud and snow that we tried to clear out, but mostly just ended up lying in. We took turns on watch, 2 hours on and 2 hours off, and during my off periods I'd curl up under a shelter half trying to sleep, but mostly just shaking from the cold and thinking about home. I was from Pennsylvania, from a small town outside Philadelphia, where my father ran a hardware store and my mother taught 3rd grade, and I'd enlisted right after Pearl Harbor like every other patriotic kid who thought war was going to be some kind of grand adventure. I'd gone to officer candidate school because I had 2 years of college and tested well, and they made me a forward observer because I was good at math and stayed calm under pressure. Now here I was in a frozen hole in Belgium, responsible for directing the most powerful weapon system in the army while rationing ammunition like it was my last meal on Earth. The Panzers came the next morning, December 23rd, about an hour after dawn, when the fog was still thick and the visibility was down to maybe 200 yards at best. I heard them before I saw them, that distinctive sound of German tank engines that's different from our Shermans, deeper and more guttural, and then the squeak and rattle of tracks on frozen ground. I got on the binoculars and strained to see through the fog, and that's when they started to materialize like ghosts coming out of the mist. I counted 4 tanks initially, Panzer IVs from what I could make out of their silhouettes, moving in a column along the road that led to the junction I'd been watching. Behind them I could see infantry, at least a company's worth, maybe more, following the armor in that textbook German combined arms approach that had been kicking our asses from Normandy to here. I grabbed the radio handset from Kowalski and called back to the Fire Direction Center, using the call sign Thunder 6 Actual for Lieutenant Colonel Elkins, who I knew would be monitoring the FO net personally given how critical ammunition was. Thunder 6 Actual, this is Observer 2 fire mission over. The reply came back immediately, Elkins's voice crackling through the static. Observer 2, Thunder 6 Actual, send it. I took a breath, looked at the map sheet I had protected under a piece of canvas, and started calling in the coordinates. Grid 847362, enemy armor, 4 Panzers in column with infantry support approximately company strength, moving southwest on approach to junction. Request time on target mission 6 rounds high explosive over. There was a pause longer than I liked, and I knew Elkins was doing the math on whether 4 tanks and a company of infantry were worth 6 rounds of our dwindling ammunition supply. Finally, his voice came back. Observer 2, Understand 4 enemy tanks and infantry. That's a priority target. Shot out, wait. I heard the acknowledgement from the battery. Shot out, meaning the rounds were on the way, and I started counting in my head. The time of flight for a 105mm shell at that range was roughly 30 seconds, give or take, and I kept my binoculars locked on that column, while Kowalski huddled next to me in the crater, his cough sounding worse in the cold morning air. The thing about artillery that makes it so terrifyingly effective is that it arrives without warning if you do it right. There's no sound, no indication, no chance to react. 1 second you're rolling down a road in a Panzer IV thinking you're about to overrun some frozen American position, and the next second the world explodes around you in a storm of high explosive and hot metal that tears through armor plate like it's paper. I watched through the binoculars as all 6 rounds impacted within 5 seconds of each other, right on top of that column, exactly where I'd called them. The first 2 rounds hit just in front of the lead tank, and I saw the Panzer try to swerve, but the 3rd and 4th rounds landed directly on the column itself. There was a massive secondary explosion, bright orange flame and black smoke billowing up, and I knew we'd hit ammunition storage or fuel tanks or both. The last 2 rounds fell among the infantry, and I saw bodies thrown into the air, saw men scattering in every direction trying to escape the kill zone. I kept watching professional assessment mode now, counting results. The lead Panzer was burning, definitely out of action, smoke pouring from every hatch. The second tank had thrown a track and was slewing sideways across the road, blocking the entire column. I couldn't see clear damage to the 3rd and 4th tanks, but they'd stopped moving, and their crews were probably buttoned up trying to figure out what the hell had just happened. The infantry had taken casualties, maybe 20 or 30 men down, and the rest were either hugging the ground or running back the way they'd come. I got back on the radio. Thunder 6, actual, Observer 2, splash. Estimate 1 enemy tank destroyed, 1 damaged and immobilized. Heavy casualties to infantry, column has stopped advance, over. Elkins came back on immediately. Observer 2, outstanding shooting. Do you need repeat mission? I looked at the scene through my binoculars, at the burning Panzer and the scattered infantry, and the column that wasn't moving anymore, and I made a calculation that's haunted me ever since. We had maybe 24 rounds of 105mm ammunition left in the entire battalion at that point, and this column was already disrupted and no longer an immediate threat to our lines. There were going to be more targets, more German attacks, more situations where we'd need those shells. Thunder 6 actual, Observer 2, negative on repeat mission. Target is neutralized. Will continue to observe. Over. His voice came back with something that might have been approval. Roger, good job, keep us posted out. Kowalski looked at me with eyes that were red from the cold and the cough and probably fear, though he tried to hide it. So we got him, Lieutenant. I nodded, still watching through the binoculars as the Germans tried to organize themselves around the wreckage of their column. Yeah, we got them. 6 rounds, probably 20 German soldiers dead, 1 tank destroyed, 1 damaged, entire attack stopped before it developed. That's what we do, Eddie. That's what we're here for. He coughed again, that wet, rattling sound, and said, Yes, sir. I wanted to tell him something reassuring. Something about how we were going to make it through this and get home. But I'd learned by then that those kinds of promises were worse than saying nothing. We stayed in that crater for another 6 hours, watching the Germans recover their wounded, and eventually pull back the damaged tanks under cover of more fog that rolled in around noon. I called back regular situation reports, but didn't request any more fire missions, even though I could have probably gotten approval to harass their withdrawal. Every round mattered, and I knew there were other FOs in other positions around the perimeter who were facing their own targets and making their own calculations about what was worth the ammunition and what wasn't. The German attack never developed at that junction, and I've always believed it was because that one fire mission broke their momentum at exactly the right moment. The next day, December 24th, the weather finally started to clear, and we got our first airdrops of ammunition and supplies. I watched the C-47s come in low over Bastogne, taking flak from German positions, and I saw the parachutes blossoming in the sky like flowers, each one carrying desperately needed shells and food and medical supplies. The artillery batteries immediately started receiving resupply, and by evening we were back up to 100 rounds per gun, which felt like infinite wealth after the rationing we'd been doing. Lieutenant Colonel Elkins called all the FOs back to the command post that night for a briefing, and when I walked in, he shook my hand and said, "Kellerman, that mission you called on the 23rd stopped what intelligence now confirms was a battalion-level attack that was supposed to punch through our lines and link up with a larger German force moving in from the east. You saved lives and you saved ammunition doing it. Well done." I accepted the compliment because refusing it would have been insulting, but I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a guy who'd done math correctly under pressure and gotten lucky that the survey data was close enough, and the gun crews were skilled enough to put 6 rounds exactly where they needed to go. The Germans I'd killed that morning weren't abstractions anymore. They were guys in tanks and guys following tanks, doing their jobs the same way I was doing mine, and the fact that I'd killed them efficiently didn't make it feel any better. But that's war, and that's what being a forward observer means. You stand in a frozen crater, and you look through binoculars and you call down fire from heaven on people you've never met. And you do it because if you don't, they're going to kill your guys instead. The siege of Bastogne officially ended on December 26th, when Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. And by December 27th we were getting regular resupply, and the German pressure was collapsing all around the perimeter. I stayed with the 101st through the rest of the Bulge fighting, and into Germany itself, calling fire missions all the way to the Elbe River, and I got pretty good at it if I'm being honest. I made captain in March 1945 and took over as a battery commander when the original CO got hit by shrapnel during a German counter-battery mission. I came home in November 1945 with a Bronze Star and a head full of coordinates and adjustments and the sound of shells impacting on target. I went back to school on the GI Bill, got my degree in civil engineering, and spent 35 years designing bridges and roads in Pennsylvania. I got married, had 3 kids, lived a normal American life in the suburbs. I never talked much about the war with anyone except other veterans, and even then we mostly talked around the difficult parts. My wife knew I'd been at Bastogne, knew I'd been in the artillery, but I never told her about lying in frozen craters watching men die because of fire missions I'd called. How do you explain that to someone who's never experienced combat? How do you make them understand that you can be proud of doing your job well and sick about what that job actually entailed at the same time? Eddie Kowalski survived the war, got over his pneumonia eventually, and went home to Ohio where he worked in a steel mill for 40 years. We exchanged Christmas cards for a while after the war, but eventually lost touch the way people do. I've wondered sometimes if he remembered that morning in the crater, if he thought about those 6 rounds the way I did, if he understood how close we came to not making it out of there at all. The Germans could have sent infantry around to flank us while we were focused on that column. They could have had their own artillery observer somewhere calling fire on our position. Any number of things could have gone wrong, but they didn't, and we survived to tell the story. The mission I called on December 23, 1944, became something of a legend in the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. 6 rounds, 1 destroyed tank, 1 damaged tank, probably 30 German casualties, and an entire battalion-level attack stopped before it could develop, all accomplished with ammunition that was being counted, shell by shell. It went into the battalion history, got mentioned in after-action reports, probably contributed to my Bronze Star citation. But what nobody wrote down, what doesn't appear in any official record, is what it felt like to watch those rounds impact and know that I'd just killed a bunch of guys who were probably cold and scared and far from home, just like we were. Professional soldiers doing a professional job, and I was better at mine that morning than they were at theirs. I'm 88 years old now, and I've got grandkids who ask me about the war sometimes. They've seen movies, played video games, and they think it was all adventure and heroism and clear-cut good versus evil. I tell them it was a lot more complicated than that war is mostly cold and fear and trying to do your job well enough to survive another day. I tell them about Bastogne, about being surrounded and low on ammunition and watching German tanks materialize out of the fog. Sometimes I tell them about that fire mission on December 23rd, about calling in 6 rounds of 105mm high explosive and watching them land exactly where they needed to go. But I don't tell them about the burning Panzer or the bodies in the snow or the way Kowalski's cough sounded in the frozen air of that crater. Some things you keep to yourself. The thing about being a forward observer, The thing I've learned over 75 years of thinking about it is that you live in this strange space between action and consequence. You're not the guy pulling the trigger, you're not the guy loading the shell, you're not even the guy giving the order to fire. You're just providing information, calling out coordinates, making professional assessments about targets and priorities. But you're also the essential link in the chain, the guy without whom none of it happens, and that makes you just as responsible as anyone else for the death and destruction that follows. It's a burden I've carried my whole life, along with the pride of having done the job well and the knowledge that doing it well saved American lives. Those 6 rounds I called in at Bastogne took approximately 30 seconds from the time they left the gun tubes until they impacted on target. 30 seconds during which those German tankers and infantry had no idea what was coming. No chance to take cover, no opportunity to change the outcome. That's the nature of artillery, and that's what makes it so effective and so terrible at the same time. It's impersonal and efficient and absolutely devastating when it's done right, and I got very good at doing it right. I drove back to Bastogne in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of the battle, took my wife and one of my sons who wanted to see where his old man had fought. We walked the ground around the town, visited the museums and memorials, and I tried to find the crater where Kowalski and I had spent that night before calling the fire mission. The landscape had changed completely, half a century of peace and reconstruction erasing the scars of war, and I couldn't locate the exact spot. Maybe that's for the best. The crater's gone, the barn's gone, the burned-out Panzers gone. Everything physical that connected me to that morning has disappeared. But the memory hasn't, and it never will. When people thank me for my service now, which happens more often than it used to since World War II veterans have become such a small and honored group, I accept it graciously, but I'm never quite sure what to say in return. I served because my country needed me to serve, and I did my job to the best of my ability under extremely difficult circumstances. I'm proud of that, in a complicated way that acknowledges both the necessity of what we did and the terrible cost of doing it. The fire mission I called on December 23, 1944, was exactly what I was trained to do and exactly what the situation required, and it worked perfectly. That's something to be proud of, I suppose, even if the pride comes with ghosts attached. Every December 23rd I think about those Panzers rolling out of the fog, about the cold in that crater, about Kowalski's cough and Lieutenant Colonel Elkin's voice on the radio, and the sight of 6 rounds of 105mm high explosive landing exactly on target. I think about the German soldiers who died that morning, about families in Germany who got telegrams saying their sons or husbands or fathers weren't coming home, about the randomness of who lives and who dies in war. And I think about the fact that if I'd hesitated, if I'd called the fire mission 30 seconds later, or gotten the coordinates wrong, or requested the wrong type of ammunition, the outcome could have been completely different. War runs on these tiny moments of decision and execution, and I happened to get mine right. I called artillery on German armor at Bastogne, and the 105mm shells hit before those Panzers even realized they were under fire. It was textbook forward observer work, the kind of mission they teach in artillery school, as an example of how to do everything correctly. It stopped an attack, saved American lives, and demonstrated exactly why the forward observer position exists in the first place. I'm proud of it. I'm haunted by it. And I've spent 75 years trying to reconcile those two feelings into something I can live with. That's the truth of it, as honest as I can make it. That's what it meant to be a forward observer at Bastogne in December 1944, and that's the burden I've carried ever since.